Pong was the first major successful video game of any kind, and for a time it was copied to death. These copycat games were essentially the same game with only slight variations on the Pong formula. It was only 4 years later, in 1976, that Atari took their own concept with Pong and moved the paddle genre into a more vertical landscape with Breakout. Now, I don't know if there is such a thing as the paddle genre, but what else do you call games like these? Well anyway, 10 years later, Techno's Arkanoid would take the paddle genre even further by introducing power-ups into the gameplay, but the height of the paddle genre, not including pinball games, has to be Opera House's '92 hit with Devilish for the Sega Game Gear. This game picks up where Arkanoid left off, and throws in another repositionable paddle to complement the already static one, and the gameplay in Devilish more than justifies this new feature, and it's surprising how quickly moving two paddles around becomes second nature to you, but I'm just getting started, so let's really dive into Devilish. As I said, Devilish could be thought of as a natural successor to Arkanoid, in that it takes the foundations of that game and builds from it a unique game that's way more than just a slightly improved version of its predecessor. But what really sets Devilish apart from Arkanoid is you now have actual levels instead of just a fixed stage, and it's in these levels you have to guide a ball around by bouncing it through 8 stages. Now, this kind of gameplay couldn't work with just one paddle, as you can't direct the ball to the right or the left of the screen with just the bottom horizontal paddle, and that's why I imagine a second paddle was introduced. You can flip the top paddle in one of 4 flip rotations, and in one of these rotations it also moves the bottom paddle into 2 smaller ones. Figuring out when to use these paddle positions is where the challenge really lies. The first time I played Devilish, I didn't even know you could flip the top paddle, and because of that I could never ever get any further than level 7, but once I learnt this I soon teared through this game. And that's not to say this game is easy. You have multiple settings for difficulty and ball counts, so you can tailor the challenge to your own liking. This brings balance to the game and makes Devilish a fair challenge. And something else that aids you in this challenge is the specials. They can explode unwanted blocks, give you extra lives, turn your ball into an unstoppable flame ball that destroys everything in its path, or shrink your paddles and temporarily put you in a bind. Thanks for that. There are 2 things about this game that got on my nerves. The first was when your ball gets stuck in a bouncing loop, and the second is when your ball keeps rebouncing back into a monster's mouth. Every second you spend in these loops is less time you have to complete the stages. For the first few levels this isn't really an issue as you have plenty of time, but in later levels you need every second and you cannot afford to waste any time. Once I knew this game inside and out, these issues really became a problem, and on later playthroughs I was able to figure out how to break out these loops very quickly. What surprised me about this game was it did receive 2 sequels, one for the Genesis/Mega Drive and one for the Nintendo DS. Now before we talk about these sequels, let's talk about the US publisher for the original Game Gear and later Genesis sequel. Outside Japan and Europe, Devilish was published by Sage's Creation. Now Sage's Creation was a lot like Working Designs, in that they focused solely on localizing and publishing Japanese Game Gear and Genesis games for North America. In their short life they published a few games, and whatever happened to them, who knows, but let's move on to the sequels. A year later, a sequel to Devilish with the subtitle The Next Position was released on the Genesis/Mega Drive. It's a fairly faithful port, but for some reason it lacks the magic of the original. It goes through the motion and does what is required, but never tries to be anything more. From a visual standpoint, it's technically a better looking game, but it lacks the distinct high-adventure 8-bit art style of the original Devilish. I do have to give the sequel's soundtrack credit, as the opening tune is simply incredible, and there are some really good 16-bit remixes of tunes from the first game. Overall, both these games have excellent soundtracks, but let's get back to the original game for a moment. Even though the original Devilish was on a handheld system, the small screen size never bothered me. In fact, this made the experience better. Having a smaller screen forced Opera House to make sure the call to action was always centre stage, and the only way to do that was to create tight but well designed levels that fitted within the confines of this system. And that means this game is always on point, unlike the Genesis sequel in which you have massive amounts of empty screen space distracting you from what you should be focusing on, the game. The limitations of the Game Gear forced the developer of Devilish to go the extra mile and create a one-of-a-kind handheld experience. It's funny to think that the sequel got bettered by an 8-bit handheld game, and that is some achievement. Over a decade later, the Devilish IP was licensed out to Starfish so they could remake the Genesis sequel on the Nintendo DS. It's cool you can now play a Devilish game over 2 screens, but that's the only good thing I can say about this game. It still has the same problem as the 16-bit sequel in that it never tries to be anything more. And other than the use of the dual screens, it makes no use of the additional features of the Nintendo DS. And that's a shame because I believe this kind of game would work really well on a touchscreen device. It's sad that in all these years, we never really got a true sequel to Devilish, but just on the off chance the creators, or even the current rights owners to Devilish are watching this review, let me be bold and suggest something. Hey, why don't you revisit this franchise and make a true sequel to Devilish? Because as great as the first game was, it barely scratched the surface, and I believe there is still potential greatness from this series still left to discover. So, my final thoughts. Devilish on the Game Gear is a game that got it right the first time. It's an addictive title that should be in everyone's Game Gear collection and gets my thumb approval. Only consider the 16-bit sequel or the Nintendo DS remake of it if you don't own a working Game Gear. Well, that wraps up another episode of Michael's Retro Game Reviews. Big thank you to M&M Games for donating a copy of Devilish, and big thank you to YouTube user Arcade Game Table for fixing up and sending me a working Game Gear. And more importantly, thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon.